3 rings for the elven kings under the sky, 7 for the dwarf lords in their halls of stone, 9 for mortal men doomed to die, 1 for the Dark Lord on his dark throne in the land of Mordor, where the shadows lie. When my dad first read me those words, I knew that I was in for something completely different. Now, he'd read me many wonderful books already, including The Hobbit. But with that first page of The Lord of the Rings, I felt like I had entered into a completely different world. Now, part of that was my dad's delivery. He'd get this far-off glint in his eye and this mysterious timbre to his voice. And it was subtle, but it was perfect. And he'd sit in his red leather chair, open his beautiful copies of The Lord of the Rings, and I'd sit down on the floor in front of him. And before I knew it, I was caught up in the epic struggle of good versus evil, and I loved it. And 9-year-old Ian must have soaked these stories up because they are deep in the marrow of my bones. That poem that I recited for you, that's the ring verse. It was also my 3rd grade show and tell. Now, I could have brought a transformer, because those are cool, but I chose the poem because it meant something to me, and it still does. Because as I've grown and continue to read these stories for myself, I've started to see that all these wizards and kings and elves and dwarves and hobbits had incredibly human stories that I could relate to. And I don't think I'm the only one. Because while Lord of the Rings has been enormously influential and successful, it is not the only fantasy out there. Not by far. In fact, now is the time to be a fantasy fan. They are constantly producing new stories as books, films, video games, TV series. And the reason for this is that fantasy is inherently an adaptable genre. Its borders aren't defined, and so it can be anything. Tolkien actually wrote about this, and he said that fantasy is indescribable, but it is not imperceptible. And what this means is that we know the tropes, we've seen them before, but they can constantly be rearranged into new kaleidoscopic constellations that can be prepared for new audiences. So, an example. Actually, the oldest example in the book, or oral tradition, or cave painting for that matter, it's very old. This is the hero's journey. Now, some of you may already be familiar with the hero's journey, but for those of you who are not, here it is. Imagine you are the hero of a story, and you begin in a place of status quo. Nothing's changing. So think Luke Skywalker and the binary sunset, or Bilbo Baggins enjoying a puff of pipeweed in the Shire, or you're Harry Potter and you're locked in a broom closet. Nothing's changing until suddenly there's a call to adventure and an arrival of a messenger or a guide who has information that you need to be successful. So, this could be a letter from a wizard. Or it could be that a wizard with a troop of dwarves comes and trashes your hobbit hole. Or a space wizard with a lightsaber. There are many wizards in fantasy. But they come, they give you the information you need, and then you find yourself propelled out your door into a new, fantastic world. And here you have success, you have failure, you grow. Until you come to the deepest, darkest step in your journey, and that is the abyss. And here you fail. So, let's go back to Luke Skywalker. This time, it's Cloud City, Empire Strikes Back. Now, he has just, spoiler alert, by the way, he has just found out that Darth Vader is his father. He's been beaten in physical combat. He's fallen down a literal bottomless pit. That's the abyss. The story could end here. But it doesn't, because the hero keeps going. The hero claws their way back to the light. They claim the elixir of the goddess, which is whatever they've been looking for, and then they return home, only to find that they have been changed so profoundly by the journey that they can never go back. And so, the story continues. Now, I've given you 3 examples. There are many more. And the reason we keep retelling this story, even though we know the ending, the reason it resonates with us is it's our story. It's life. We are born into a world full of danger and opportunity. We succeed, we fail, we grow. And this continues on throughout our lives. And this is the first great truth that fantasy can teach us, that we are indeed the heroes of our very own stories. Now, you may be thinking, yes, but Ian, the hero's journey is everywhere. It's not just in fantasy. Can't I get the same kind of reading from other stories? And you can, and I hope you do. But fantasy is unique. Because while other stories, other genres like science fiction, deal with the improbable, fantasy lives in the impossible. And within that impossibility is an infinite number of impossibilities that can map onto an infinite number of people and places and times. There are no Dark Lords, or Rings of Power, or much to my personal disappointment, lightsabers. They have no real-world analogs. And because of this, they can be anything. I seriously doubt that anyone here has a father who is a raving Sith Lord. But perhaps you have found yourself disappointed with a relationship with a parent, and like Luke, you wanted something more. Or, to go back to Lord of the Rings, I've never encountered a ring of power capable of destroying the world. But we all have our burdens, those weights that only we know and only we can carry. And in those moments, Frodo's struggle with the ring can give us insight. But maybe you're not dealing with a burden right now. Maybe someone you love is. And in those moments, you may realize that all you can do, like Sam, is walk beside them and carry them the last steps up the mountain. We relate to these characters and their journeys because it is our journey. We're all on it together. This does not mean we are on the same path. And this is where the world gets a little confused, because the world loves to draw lines in the sand and to force us into these overly simplified categorizations that lend themselves to us versus them thinking. That's not fantasy. That is what Tolkien would call a morbid delusion. And what we need is the pure art of creation, which is fantasy, to enchant us so we can see things more clearly. An example. When I was 16 years old, my brother, he's basically my Yoda when it comes to all things fantasy. And he's read everything. He's read it twice. And he came to me and he said, Ian, read Elantris by Brandon Sanderson. And up to this point, I just read The Lord of the Rings about 1,000,000 times. So this was my first experience with modern, high, epic fantasy. And I read all night long. Admittedly, school was a bit rough the next day. But it was completely worth it, because that book explored things like religious conflict, propaganda, and othering, and how these are potential but perilous paths to power. And I'd never seen anything like it, and I wanted more, and my brother delivered. He then gave me The Way of Kings from the Stormlight Archive, also by Brandon Sanderson. My brother's a fan. So am I, by the way. And in that book, you remember how excited I was about the epic struggle of good versus evil? And I still am, because it's great. But sometimes what you want is a story that reflects the complexity of the world a little differently. And in these books, the heroes who are fighting the faceless mythological terror that has resurfaced and threatens to destroy the world as they know it, well, they come to realize something, that it's not faceless, that it's people with their own stories. This realization leads to empathy and understanding and even respect, which makes it that much harder for them to just kill each other with impunity. You see, people are incommensurable. We are complex. So too are our struggles and our conflicts, be they social or political or religious. They cannot be boiled down to bumper stickers and campaign slogans. They need more, and fantasy is a way to help us with this. Because I have never read a fantasy novel about Democrats and Republicans, and thank goodness, because that sounds so boring. But I have read many books that explore different ideas from across the political spectrum, divorced from their real-world political ideologies. What this means is that fantasy worlds can give us new perspective through which we can consider new ideas free of bias. And at a time when we are so eager to reach for our swords instead of each other's hands, a little cognitive dissonance, a little questioning of ourselves is not just healthy, it's heroic. Speaking of heroism, I recently completed the Herculean task of finishing Robert Jordan's massive Wheel of Time series. It took me the better part of, well, forever. But I enjoyed it, and I especially enjoyed Robert Jordan's cyclical concept of time. And the quote, "There are no beginnings nor endings to the turning of the wheel of time." And this relates to what I've been talking about. Because stories resurface when and how we need them. Because from time immemorial, we have made sense of ourselves and each other and the world around us through stories and fantasy. And it is important to remember that everything awe-inspiring and magnificent about fantasy was first imagined into existence by a human heart. And as fantasy helps us to know ourselves, we then give shape and form back to fantasy. Now, the wheel has turned for me, and I find I have a new role in someone else's story. I am the messenger and the guide, holding the very books my father read to me from, as my son, who is 8, sits and listens. And when his sisters are older, they will join us, because I want them to know not just what they mean to me, but that they are the heroes of stories that are worth telling, that they can grow and make mistakes and do not have to stay in the abyss, and that the world, though at times dark and frightening, is also beautiful and inspiring. And for all of you, as you continue your own journeys, I hope that when you read your favorite stories and you make your escape, that you don't escape from the world, but rather to a new vantage point through which you can perceive the world that much more clearly. So that when you find yourself back in the real world and you regard yourself and those around you, I hope you can do so by the light of fantasy. Thank you.